Drugs played a pivotal role in the music of the 1960s, and today I'm going to be reviewing a book that explores the highs and lows of the Beatles and drugs here on Pop Goes the 60s. Riding So High, The Beatles and Drugs is by Joe Goodden. This came out in 2017. And I wanted to delve into this book because I wanted to have a better understanding of how the impact the drugs had on the Beatles' breakup. And I got a lot more than I bargained for because this book covers their drug use from their very early teen years, really through the excesses of the 70s and 80s. One of the things that's been prevalent in pop music since the 60s is the glorification of drugs. And this book does not glorify drugs in any way. The thing I really like about this book and what makes it valuable is that Goodden suspends any moral judgments on the Beatles and just sticks to the facts. One thing that if you are in the music industry, you don't really have a need to go out and find drugs. The drugs will come and find you. And that's pretty much what happened to the Beatles. And this book lays out a chronological telling of the Beatles' history and all the drugs that came and went as their history progressed. And it's kind of interesting because the drugs that came and went are almost like music hit songs on the charts. You know, some drugs go on the charts and then they fall off to give way to another drug that gives you a different kind of high. So the Beatles' drug use is pretty well chronicled in their history. And aside from what we know of the early days when they were smoking cigarettes and scoring the occasional beer, they did encounter some other drugs along the way too. So when they got into the music industry, almost immediately, they were approached by a guy named Royston Ellis. He was a beat poet and he was looking for some bands to back him up. He was from London and was in Liverpool doing some poetry readings. And George Harrison ran into him and he got a gig with Royston Ellis or backing them up. Through Royston Ellis, they learned how to get the Benzedrine out of a Benzedrine inhaler and get high off of that. So one day back at one of the flats, the four Beatles, being John, Paul, George, and Stuart, and Royston Ellis did this, and they were up all night gabbing away on this stuff. And that was their first real drug experience. Now, the Royston Ellis experience happened before their Hamburg days, and everybody knows that when they got to Hamburg, they experienced Preludin and these essentially diet pills to give them a pep, and it was kind of a form of amphetamine, I guess. And they obviously were able to play and sustain long nights of playing and drinking while on those drugs. So the book talks extensively about the Preludin, where that came from. One of the things that's great about this book is all the drugs that are talked about. It kind of gives a background on how these drugs infiltrated the society and into pop culture. Now, the famous story that we've all heard is that the Beatles first tried marijuana with Bob Dylan in 1964. Well, that's actually not true. They had tried it before. Not sure why that story didn't really get out. I guess just because the meeting with Dylan just made it more romantic and more made for a better story. But they recalled a time in 1961 when an older Liverpool drummer had given them some marijuana. And apparently that was the night they all learned how to do the twist. But Lennon kind of reflected on that and said, well, we were all pretty drunk anyway, so the marijuana didn't really do anything for them. So they didn't really take too much note of it at that time. So in 1964, with the famous meeting between the Beatles and Dylan, they had a really great night together, and they all got high, and Brian Epstein was there, and they really must have had some good cannabis because there was a very memorable night for them, and that was kind of the start of their marijuana period. So the marijuana period for the Beatles really kicked in the following year in 1965 during the filming of the movie Help. And it was interesting because after A Hard Day's Night, after 1964, the Beatles were worldwide stars. And the follow-up movie that they did, they kind of were able to pick their project. And part of the reason they picked that Help got chosen, some of the locations were chosen, and in particular the Bahamas, was because that was an area you could smoke cannabis openly. And the Beatles were aware of that. It's one of the reasons they wanted to go there. So their new love of weed really made shooting difficult, and I think they had stretched Dick Lester to his wit's end with take after take. Here's a quote that George Harrison says of this time. "It might not have affected creativity for other people," said George Harrison. "I know it did for us, and it did for me. The first thing the people who smoke marijuana and got into music found that it somehow focuses your attention better on the music, so you can hear it clearer." So during the shooting of Help, the Beatles first encountered heroin. Paul McCartney was offered heroin by two women. I think it was on the set, or somebody in conjunction with the shooting of the film helped. And Dick Lester tells about that story, which is kind of interesting. So that's a good one that I did not know about, that I first heard from this book. So we're in 1965, and this is the first time John and George get dosed with LSD unknowingly. And obviously this is the famous story of the dental experience, where they had an acquaintance that George knew, a dentist who had them over for dinner. And as you can imagine, that everybody wanted to get in with the Beatles and have them for dinner and get close to them in any way possible. And somehow this guy got the two Beatles to come over with their wives. So they had this dinner party, and he slipped LSD into their coffee. And when he told them that the Beatles were going to get up and go to a show, a band was playing that they wanted to see at a local club, and he said, "No, you can't leave. You've been given LSD." And Lennon was the only one of the four who had heard about LSD and was really upset that he had done that without them knowing. So they insisted upon leaving. They made it their way to a couple of clubs, and they had this wild experience with the effects of LSD hitting all of them in different ways. And that was the beginning of something very new. So by the end of 1965, all four Beatles had tried LSD, but generally speaking, they were smoking marijuana regularly. That was the drug of choice at the time. The album Rubber Soul was very much influenced by marijuana. Uppers were still used on tour. So Cynthia Lennon offered in one of her books that John Lennon would often take LSD after some concerts, and that would kind of relax him, but he became somewhat incoherent. And this is when their marriage started to get more so on the rocks, because they weren't communicating very well. Now, in Barry Miles' book on Paul McCartney, Paul had said in that book that generally John and Paul would have these writing sessions that would go no more than 3 hours. And they were always very productive. They always kept off the drugs during those writing sessions, and then after they were done and they got something out of it, they would, I guess, treat themselves to a little bit of marijuana or something and just kind of relax with something after the fact, after they got their work done. Now, LSD, as I mentioned, had started to come between John and Cynthia. Cynthia said John would become more incoherent while on LSD. Jane Asher later reflected that Paul McCartney changed after he started taking LSD. So you can see how the relationships were affected by these drugs, particularly LSD. And it started to obviously shape the music. I mean, it's very clear how the music changed when LSD started being used by musicians. The whole psychedelic period was based on hallucinogenic drugs and marijuana, which is a mild hallucinogen. But the music started to change, and it started to get a little more experimental. So as Goodden takes us through this journey, he really did a great job of acquiring all the little tidbits of interviews that were mentioning drugs in any kind of way. And he puts it in a chronological timeline that's very easy to follow. And he keeps it in context of what was going on in the music industry at the time with some of the Beatles' friends, some of the people that were also taking drugs around them, where the drugs came from. So Goodden does a great job of giving us a nice timeline, and he puts it in a very easy-flowing, easy-to-read narrative. Another drug that was being used by the Beatles at this time was cocaine. And Paul McCartney was using cocaine more so than LSD. So what you had was Harrison and Lennon using more of LSD in '67, and McCartney being on cocaine. Those are very different drugs, and you can kind of see the LSD, I think, really helped to destroy the egos of Harrison and Lennon, and some of the production slowed down while McCartney's started to speed up a little bit. I think that may have had to do with some of the drugs that they were using at the time. Paul McCartney made a quote about the effects of LSD. Here's one of the things he said. He said that he was deeply committed to the possibilities of LSD as a universal cure-all. He said, after I took it, it opened my eyes. So that was one of the things that LSD was almost like a religious experience for some people. And the talk of having all politicians take it, that there would be some kind of world peace, that was part of what the drug did for you. So as that drug became kind of faddish, along with the whole psychedelic music thing, in 1968, the Beatles started to change gears a bit. They went to India to study with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. So in 1967, one of the other things that they were exploring was meditation. And I think they were already starting to see, I think they were curious about all things like this, but I think they thought that the drugs weren't the answer and possibly something more spiritual was, hence this Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and they found themselves going to India and studying transcendental meditation. So one of the reasons John quit taking LSD initially had to do with the bad trips that he was encountering. And after the experience in India, where it wasn't a very good parting with the Maharishi, if you know the story, and I think John traded one guru for another, where he went back on to LSD. He always kind of needed a drug of some kind. In 1968, there was a very odd turn of events here that John Lennon had with LSD. It was in May of '68. He had taken LSD with Pete Shotton one night, and Cynthia was out of town. She was in Italy. And Shotton and John Lennon were smoking cannabis and taking LSD, and they were up till morning. And in the morning, this is where John Lennon proclaimed to be the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, what he did at this point is he called a meeting immediately for the Apple heads, which are the four Beatles, Derek Taylor, Neil Aspinall, and maybe one other person. And John Lennon told everybody he was the second coming, and they all just kind of, okay. And they, I think, were a little bit used to some of John's antics. And this was maybe further out than they were used to seeing, but they kind of said, okay, well, great, then they all went out to lunch. Anyway, that night, John Lennon was with Pete Shotton again, and they're smoking cannabis and taking more LSD, and he called up Yoko Ono. That's the night that she came over, and they spent that night together. And really after that, Lennon was off in a completely different direction. So you had two LSD trips back to back that one he thought he was Jesus Christ, the other one was a union with Yoko Ono that never really ended. That started just a new direction in his life, and it's very curious that it happened off of those two LSD trips. So as they went into the recording of the White Album, Yoko Ono at this point was always by John's side. One of the things that happened during this time is the Beatles, or as John Lennon and Yoko Ono started using heroin. This was also a turning point because John Lennon became harder to deal with. Not just because he was with Yoko Ono, but if he was on heroin, he was a little bit volatile at times, or you just couldn't communicate with him all the time. So Yoko Ono had explained they were kind of proud of the heroin use at the time. I mean, they were very much influenced by William Burroughs' The Naked Lunch and books like that. They were somewhat glorifying it to a point. So here's what Ono says. She described their heroin use as, quote, a celebration of ourselves as artists. And the references to drugs quickly found their way into Lennon's songs. Obviously, Cold Turkey. Another one would be Happiness is a Warm Gun, I guess. There are others. But they started to go off on their own artistic venture by themselves that was completely separate from the Beatles. I think the combination of Yoko Ono and the heroin helped to keep John Lennon on just a separate path from the band. So the good thing about the Goodden book here is once, this book doesn't end with the Beatles' breakup. What this does is it goes deep into their personal lives as the 70s and 80s wear on. John Lennon and Yoko Ono had issues with heroin all through the decade of the 70s, trying to get off heroin by using methadone. They got addicted to that, so that was also an issue. Paul McCartney was drinking heavily in 1970. Obviously Ringo Starr was the only one that ended up going to rehab of any of the Beatles. That was in the 80s for his alcoholism. George Harrison suffered from some drinking and cocaine as well. So in the rock and roll lifestyle in the 70s, it was just rampant. It was just normal to have drugs as part of the lifestyle. And McCartney he got busted, I think 5 times, maybe 6 times between him and Linda between 1970 and 1980. All those busts made it difficult for them to travel, and it really had repercussions that they have to deal with, the ones surviving Beatles have to deal with to this day. It's hard to imagine what the Beatles' history would have been like if drugs weren't as prevalent in their lives, because we know that it affected the music so much, and obviously it affected them as well. So this book does a great job of giving the history from the very early days till well into their 40s of the drug use and how it affected their personal lives and how it affected the music and some of the other relationships they had with bandmates, etc. And I would highly recommend this because it's a great piece of historiography, actually, because it really gives a balanced account of all the evidence that we have on their drug use, which was so prevalent in their lives. Another article I'd like to bring to your attention is one by Ken Womack. He did an article a couple years ago called "Heroin Was the Fifth Beatle." I'm going to put a link to that below. That's also rather interesting. Hey, make sure to check back because I have many more book reviews coming along with band histories and, of course, more videos on the Beatles. Thanks for watching.